August 26, 1346. The French army had every conceivable advantage. They outnumbered the English more than 3 to 1. Nearly 30,000 men faced fewer than 9,000. They fought on their own soil. They fielded the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Armored knights trained for war since childhood, mounted on war horses that cost more than entire villages. For centuries, this had been enough. French knights were not merely soldiers. They were the embodiment of medieval military power. Their steel armor represented the highest technology of the age. Their horses were bred, trained, and conditioned for shock combat. Their victories over feudal militias and peasant infantry had been so consistent that defeat by commoners was barely imaginable. War for them was not survival. It was honor. It was status. It was personal glory and profit through ransom. They rode into battle expecting the familiar outcome: a unified cavalry charge, a broken enemy line, and another confirmation of their inherited dominance. Nothing in their past experience suggested otherwise. Across the field stood the English army, smaller, poorer, and largely composed of men without noble titles. They were free peasants and yeomen, not aristocrats. They did not wear the finest armor. They did not ride expensive war horses. Many of them carried no swords at all. What they carried instead was training. From childhood, English archers had been forced by law to practice every week. Years of repetition had turned ordinary men into specialists, capable of sustained, coordinated fire. They did not fight for personal glory. They fought to survive, to hold their position, and to obey orders. These two armies did not simply differ in numbers or equipment. They represented two completely different ways of understanding war. On the slopes near Crécy, those two systems were about to collide. One of them would not survive the day. Before Crécy, the medieval knight was considered unbeatable. This belief was not romantic fantasy. It was built on centuries of experience. Heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields for generations. Armored horsemen had crushed peasant uprisings, scattered feudal militias, and decided wars through shock and momentum. A French knight represented the peak of military investment. His armor was custom-made steel, forged at enormous cost. His sword, lance, and shield were tools refined over generations. His war horse was not simply transport. It was a weapon, bred for aggression, trained to charge into massed infantry without hesitation. Together, knight and horse formed a system designed for one purpose: to break enemy formations through direct frontal assault. And it worked. Against poorly trained foot soldiers, the result was predictable. Infantry formations collapsed under the weight of charging cavalry. Panic spread. Discipline failed. Battles ended quickly. This consistency shaped how French nobles understood war. To them, combat was not a collective effort, it was personal. Victory belonged to individuals who displayed courage, strength, and noble lineage. Warfare was inseparable from honor. The battlefield was a stage where reputation was earned, ransoms were collected, and status was reinforced. The idea that commoners, men without pedigree, armor, or horses could seriously threaten this system was not just unlikely, it was offensive. French knights did not view infantry as a decisive arm. Foot soldiers existed to support cavalry, not replace it. Their role was secondary, their value was limited. In the aristocratic mind, they were tools, not equals. As a result, French tactics had barely changed for centuries. The solution to any problem remained the same: massed cavalry attack. Speed, weight, shock. Break the center. End the battle. Success in the past had reinforced confidence in the present. There was no incentive to adapt. No reason to rethink assumptions that had delivered victory time and again. By 1346, this confidence had hardened into certainty. The French knights arrived at Crécy expecting another confirmation of what they already believed: that nobility, armor, and tradition still ruled the battlefield. They did not realize that the conditions that made their dominance possible were already disappearing. The English army at Crécy was built on a different foundation. It was not an army of nobles seeking glory. It was an army of commoners trained for efficiency. Most English soldiers were yeomen, free peasants who owned land, paid taxes, and were legally required to train for war. Their most important weapon was not expensive steel, it was time. From early childhood, Englishmen were forced by law to practice archery every Sunday. Drawing a longbow was not instinctive. It required years of physical conditioning. The strain reshaped shoulders and spines. Skeletons recovered centuries later still show the damage. This training created specialists. An experienced archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. He did not aim for individual duels, he aimed into formations. His effectiveness depended on rhythm, coordination, and endurance. For these men, war was not ceremony. It was labor. They did not seek honor, they sought survival. Their pay was modest, their reward was returning home alive. This shaped their psychology. English soldiers understood that individual heroism was dangerous. A man who broke formation endangered everyone around him. Discipline was not moral virtue. It was necessity. Each archer depended on the man beside him to hold position, maintain rhythm, and follow orders. Unlike the French knights, English troops did not fight as individuals. They fought as a mechanism. Command mattered. Structure mattered. Position mattered. Every man knew where he stood and why. The English army lacked the prestige of the French. It lacked numbers, it lacked wealth. But it possessed something the French did not fully understand. It had been trained to operate as a system. At Crécy, the battlefield would not reward courage alone. It would reward coordination, endurance, and obedience. The English did not yet know how decisive that difference would be, but they were prepared to find out. Crécy was not decided by numbers or bravery. It was decided by incompatible systems. On one side stood a feudal army built around aristocratic privilege. Authority flowed from birth. Initiative belonged to individuals. Success was measured in personal valor and visible courage. The battlefield rewarded those who charged first and struck hardest. On the other side stood a force organized for control. Authority flowed from command. Initiative was limited by discipline. Success depended on coordination, repetition, and adherence to plan. These differences were not abstract. They shaped every decision made before the first arrow was fired. French knights expected battle to unfold according to tradition. Cavalry would advance, infantry would break, momentum would decide the outcome. Each noble would seek distinction through individual action. The English expected something else. They expected pressure. They expected endurance. They expected that survival would depend on holding position longer than the enemy could maintain cohesion. This difference in expectation mattered. When stress enters a battlefield, soldiers fall back on habit. At Crécy, French habit meant attack. English habit meant hold. Neither side fully understood the other. The French saw the English formation and interpreted it as weakness. Dismounted men, dense ranks, limited mobility. To a cavalry aristocracy, this looked defensive and therefore inferior. The English saw the French advance and recognized predictability. The battlefield did not merely host a clash of armies. It exposed a clash of assumptions. One system relied on speed and shock. The other relied on preparation and control. Only one of those systems was suited to the conditions at Crécy. The English longbow was not powerful because it was simple. It was powerful because it was institutional. A longbow was made from a single piece of yew, combining heartwood and sapwood to balance flexibility and force. Its length often exceeded the height of the archer. Drawing it required immense strength, sometimes the equivalent of 80 kilograms of tension. This was not a weapon a man could pick up and master quickly. It demanded years of training. England solved this problem politically. Royal law required all able-bodied men of a certain age to practice archery every week. Over decades, this produced a population with a skill no other European kingdom possessed at scale. By the mid-14th century, England did not have good archers. It had an archery culture. An experienced longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. This rate of fire mattered more than accuracy. Battles were not decided by individual shots, but by volume. Thousands of arrows launched together created sustained pressure that cavalry could not ignore or absorb. At Crécy, the English archers faced Genoese crossbowmen, professionals widely regarded as the best mercenaries in Europe. Their weapons were powerful and accurate, but slow. Reloading required time, tools, and stable footing. Time was the difference. In the interval, it took a crossbowman to reload once. An English archer could fire several arrows. Under massed fire, this imbalance became decisive. The longbow also changed targeting priorities. English archers did not aim primarily at knights. They aimed at horses. War horses were expensive, difficult to replace, and lightly armored. When they fell, riders followed. A knight on the ground, weighed down by armor, lost mobility and effectiveness. Arrow by arrow, the English did not break courage. They broke structure. The longbow was not a miracle weapon. It was ineffective without training, discipline, and supply. Arrows had to be produced in enormous quantities. Transport had to be organized. Resupply had to be continuous. At Crécy, carts delivered arrows directly to the firing line. The longbow succeeded because it was embedded in a system that supported it. And systems, once established, are difficult to stop. Edward III did not intend to win at Crécy by attacking. He intended to make the battlefield do the work for him. Knowing he was outnumbered, the English king refused open engagement. Instead, he spent an entire day selecting and preparing ground that neutralized French advantages before the battle began. The English position sat on a gentle slope between villages, with forests and a river protecting the flanks. Any French attack would have to move uphill, directly into prepared defenses. Speed, the defining element of cavalry shock, would be reduced before contact was even made. This mattered. Cavalry charges rely on momentum. Horses must reach full gallop to deliver impact. At Crécy, the incline slowed the advance, exhausting mounts and riders before they reached the English line. Edward reinforced this natural advantage. His army was divided into three formations. Dismounted knights and men-at-arms formed dense defensive centers. Archers were placed on the flanks in angled formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire. Any assault aimed at the center would be struck from multiple directions. These were not random placements. They created what modern analysts would call fire pockets, zones where attackers were exposed to sustained crossfire without the ability to respond effectively. According to several sources, the English also prepared the ground itself. Small pits were dug in front of their lines, intended to disrupt horses and break formation. Whether every pit was effective mattered less than the principle behind them. Movement was being constrained deliberately. Even the sun favored the English. The battle began late in the day, with the setting sun directly in the eyes of the advancing French. Visibility suffered, distance became harder to judge, coordination degraded. From a windmill overlooking the field, Edward III maintained a clear view of the entire battlefield. He could observe, communicate, and commit reserves when necessary. Before the first arrow was fired, the English had already imposed their rules. The French would fight uphill. They would fight into prepared fire. They would fight without room to maneuver. Crécy was no longer a contest of strength. It had become a test of control. The French army arrived at Crécy tired. They had marched long distances and expected battle the following day. King Philip VI initially intended to delay engagement and allow his troops to rest. His nobles refused. Seeing a smaller English force ahead of them, the French aristocracy pressed for immediate attack. Delay was interpreted as hesitation. Hesitation was incompatible with honor. Command authority weakened before the battle even began. The opening move fell to the Genoese crossbowmen, roughly 6,000 professionals hired to suppress the English archers. Their role was critical. If they failed, the cavalry would advance unsupported. Just before the engagement, heavy rain fell. The Genoese crossbow strings absorbed water, reducing their power. Reloading became slower, bolts fell short. The English archers, by contrast, had removed their bowstrings and kept them dry beneath their helmets. When the Genoese advanced and fired, their volleys caused little damage. The English response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of arrows cut into the advancing crossbowmen. Lacking heavy armor, the Genoese could not withstand sustained fire. Their formation broke. They retreated. To the French knights behind them, this retreat looked like cowardice. Without understanding what had happened, French nobles ordered the cavalry forward. Knights charged directly through the withdrawing crossbowmen, trampling and cutting down their own allies. Order dissolved. What should have been a coordinated assault became chaos. Infantry mixed with cavalry, units moving without alignment or command. The English did not rush. They observed. From their prepared positions, English archers continued firing into the disorganized mass. The French army had begun to destroy itself before reaching the enemy line. At Crécy, the failure was not courage. It was command. And once command collapses, even the strongest army becomes vulnerable. Despite the chaos in their own ranks, the French knights continued to attack. Wave after wave formed at the base of the slope. Each assault followed the same pattern. Riders gathered, banners rose, spurs drove horses forward, and each time the result was the same. The uphill charge stripped cavalry of its advantage. Horses slowed, formation stretched, momentum collapsed before contact. As the knights advanced, English archers shifted their aim. They did not focus on armor. They targeted horses. Arrows struck exposed flanks and necks. Wounded mounts fell, throwing riders into the mud. Fallen bodies, human and animal, became obstacles for the next wave. Each charge inherited the wreckage of the one before it. Knights who reached the English line did so exhausted and dismounted. There, they met a wall of spears and steel formed by English men-at-arms fighting on foot. These were not scattered infantry. They were disciplined, heavy soldiers, locked shoulder to shoulder. No breakthrough followed. The French command learned nothing. Honor demanded repetition. Failure could only be erased by renewed assault. Tactical reconsideration was impossible because it implied doubt, and doubt undermined aristocratic identity. At least 15 major attacks were launched. There was no coordination between them, no unified plan. Each noble sought to prove himself, to be seen, to strike first. Personal ambition replaced command structure. The battlefield became a demonstration of systemic collapse. King Philip VI lost control. Orders went unheeded. Nobles acted independently. The army no longer functioned as a single force, but as hundreds of individual charges converging on the same killing ground. Among them rode John of Bohemia, blind but determined to die as a knight. His horse was tied to those of his retainers, and together they charged into the arrows. It was courage without purpose. By nightfall, the slope before the English position was covered in bodies. The French cavalry, the pride of European warfare, had been spent without effect. At Crécy, honor did not inspire victory. It guaranteed destruction. One of Edward III's most decisive choices came before the battle ever began. He ordered his own knights to dismount. In a feudal society, this was radical. Cavalry defined aristocratic identity. To fight on foot was to surrender status, speed, and tradition. Many English nobles viewed the order as humiliating. Edward ignored them. By dismounting his men-at-arms, he transformed cavalry into heavy infantry. Armor that was designed for mounted combat became an advantage in defense. Shoulder to shoulder, English knights formed an unbreakable center that cavalry charges could not penetrate. This decision solved multiple problems at once. It removed the temptation for individual charges in pursuit of glory. A dismounted knight could not break formation without exposing himself and others. Discipline became mandatory. It strengthened coordination with archers. While arrows thinned and disorganized attackers at range, the infantry stood ready to engage any who reached the line. And it altered morale. Common soldiers saw nobles sharing the same risks, standing in the same ranks. This reinforced cohesion. The English army did not fight as classes. It fought as a unit. To the French, the dismounted English knights appeared weak. They interpreted the absence of cavalry charges as hesitation or inferiority. They were mistaken. Edward had sacrificed mobility for stability. In the conditions at Crécy, restricted terrain, prepared defenses, massed firepower, stability was decisive. The English victory was not the product of a single arm or a single class. It was the result of integration. Every element of the army supported the others. No soldier operated alone. No role existed in isolation. At Crécy, aristocracy survived only by abandoning the very traditions that defined it. The right wing of the English army was commanded by a 16-year-old. Edward, Prince of Wales, later known as the Black Prince, was fighting his first major battle. His position was not symbolic. It was one of the most exposed sectors of the English line. At the height of the fighting, French attacks pressed hard against the prince's formation. Several charges came close to breaking through. The situation deteriorated quickly. The Earl of Warwick, serving as the prince's commander and guardian, sent a messenger to King Edward III. The message was direct. The prince was in danger and required reinforcement. The king listened carefully. Then he asked a single question. Was his son still alive? When the messenger answered yes, Edward III refused to commit reserves. He understood the broader situation. The English line elsewhere was holding. The French attacks were losing momentum. What appeared critical in one sector was, in fact, survivable. The king's decision was deliberate. By withholding support, he forced the prince and his men to endure pressure without rescue. This was not neglect. It was instruction. Leadership, in Edward's view, could not be learned in safety. The message returned to the prince. No help was coming. The effect was immediate. Knowing they stood alone, the young commander's men tightened formation and fought with renewed discipline. The attack was repelled. The line held. This episode became legendary, not because it glorified youth or bravery, but because it revealed how command functioned in the English army. Decisions were made with reference to the system, not the individual. Even a king's son was subject to that logic. At Crécy, leadership was not about rescue. It was about control. When morning came, the scale of the disaster was visible. The ground before the English position was littered with bodies. Horses lay entangled with their riders. Armor marked the dead as members of the highest French nobility. The losses were catastrophic. 2 dukes were killed. 12 counts lay dead. More than 11,000 knights and nobles were estimated among the fallen. Including infantry, total French casualties likely exceeded 10,000 men. The English losses were minimal by comparison. Estimates vary, but most place them between 100 and 300 killed. This disparity was unprecedented in medieval warfare. It could not be explained by chance. It could not be explained by courage. It could not be explained by numbers. It was the result of method. Crécy destroyed the military prestige of French knighthood. The idea that heavy cavalry could dominate any battlefield simply through shock and honor no longer survived contact with reality. The victory allowed Edward III to continue his campaign without serious opposition. Soon after, he laid siege to Calais, securing a strategic foothold on the continent that England would hold for more than 2 centuries. But the deeper impact extended far beyond territory. Crécy demonstrated that disciplined infantry, properly armed and commanded, could annihilate the traditional military elite of Europe. The age of unquestioned cavalry dominance had ended, and it would not return. Crécy was not simply a French defeat. It was a structural collapse. For centuries, European warfare had been organized around the aristocracy. Knights were not only fighters, they were the economic, social, and military core of feudal society. Their dominance rested on 3 assumptions: that mounted shock was decisive, that noble birth conferred military superiority, and that infantry existed to support, not replace, the cavalry. Crécy destroyed all 3. The battle demonstrated that disciplined infantry, armed with effective long-range weapons and deployed on prepared ground, could defeat heavy cavalry outright. Not occasionally, not by chance, but reliably. This realization carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Economically, the cost imbalance was impossible to ignore. Outfitting a single knight armor, weapons, horse, and retainers could equal the annual income of an entire village. Losing thousands of such men in one battle represented a financial catastrophe. By contrast, training and equipping an English archer required time, not wealth. The return on investment was overwhelming. Socially, Crécy undermined the connection between birth and battlefield value. Effectiveness was no longer guaranteed by lineage. It was earned through training, discipline, and coordination. A commoner with a bow became more dangerous than a noble in armor. Militarily, infantry was transformed. Before Crécy, foot soldiers were considered secondary forces, useful for holding ground or finishing routed enemies. After Crécy, they became the decisive arm. Over the following centuries, armies across Europe began reorganizing around massed infantry, first with bows and crossbows, later with firearms. Cavalry did not disappear, but its role changed. It became auxiliary, reconnaissance, pursuit, exploitation of breakthroughs created by infantry fire. The age of cavalry as the primary battlefield force was over. Most importantly, Crécy marked the triumph of system over tradition. The English did not win because they were braver. They did not win because they were more numerous. They won because every element of their army, training, command, technology, logistics, and terrain worked together. This model would define European warfare for generations, and once adopted, It could not be undone. The Battle of Crécy was not remembered for its heroics. It was remembered for what it proved. In a single day, centuries of military tradition collapsed under the weight of organization and discipline. An aristocratic system built on personal honor and inherited privilege was exposed as fragile when faced with coordinated force and modern thinking. Crécy did not end knighthood as a social class. Nobles would continue to rule, to fight, and to hold power for centuries, but their unquestioned dominance on the battlefield was gone. War no longer belonged exclusively to those born into it. It belonged to those trained for it. The lesson of Crécy was simple and unforgiving. Bravery without structure is waste. Honor without adaptation is fatal. And tradition without reform invites destruction. History would repeat this lesson again and again. The only difference would be the weapons used to teach it. What other battles shattered the illusions of their age and forced the world to change how it fought?